All right, call the meeting of the Transient Guest Tax Committee into session. I'm joined by Councilwoman Elaine Schwartz, Councilmember Nathan Schmidt, and Councilwoman Karen Hiller. Purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the proposed Heritage Preservation Fund grant guidelines. Who on the staff is prepared to address this?
I am.
State your appearance, please.
Tim Paris with the Topeka Planning Department.
Okay. Go ahead.
Before you today is the recommended grant application guidelines and procedures and application form that emanated from the Historic Tourism Grant Review Committee that was established by ordinance here. I think you have a copy of that ordinance that established that review committee. The grant program itself is not new, although it had run for 4 years prior to 2012. No grants were authorized, or it just didn't function in 2012, and so far in 2013, no grants have been awarded. During the 2-year hiatus, year and a half or so, changes to the program have been recommended, and those changes are here for your review and consideration today.
Can you share with us what changes?
Yes.
Or what's new?
Yes. There are essentially 5 key changes from this version of the program and the grant guidelines in the previous version. The program, as it's recommended for your consideration today, is it's reimbursement only. The previous version of the program authorized 20% as a down payment on the grant, and did not require submittal of receipts that were paid and prior to the city's reimbursement of the allocation of the grant money. The way this program is presented to you today, it is reimbursement only after the expenditures have already been made by the grant recipient. And this has the benefit of not making the city liable for payment of unauthorized expenditures after the work has already been performed. So, and it has to be shown that it was completed and paid for with paid receipts that document the use of the money before reimbursement is authorized. And it is also based on a very successful use of the same type of reimbursement system. The city and DTI together operated a facade improvement program towards the early part of the 2000s. It may date to the pre-2000s, but it was operated very successfully, and staff operated it on behalf of DTI essentially. The council made an appropriation to DTI to do a facade improvement program, and we administered it, and this is the same formula. It's a reimbursement only. Also, this system was worked out very closely with the city's finance department, and they endorsed and rather strongly endorsed this version, this presentation of the program through city's finance department.
In terms of the reimbursement?
Yes, the reimbursement after the work has been performed, verification that the work has been performed.
Okay.
So it has received the blessing, if you will, from the city's finance department, and actually it was suggested through finance that this is the way it should operate.
Okay.
Second big change is the match. The program is authorized, or not authorized, but it's suggested to be a 50% program. So 50% grant funding, 50% match, or whatever the city authorizes in grant allocation would be responsible for an equal portion of match by the applicant. And half of the recipient's required match can be in kind. So that they're responsible for half of their own expenditures, but half of those expenditures can be donated in kind. So it lessens the overall cash requirement for the grant recipient. So some of it can be accumulated through in-kind contributions. And I have here somewhere the value of in-kind contributions. This was brought up during one of the committee meetings, the Historic Tourism Committee meetings, as to what the value of donated time would be. And it was a very good question, and I tried to find an answer for it, and I actually did find a couple answers. The State Historic Preservation Office has a formula for grants that we use. The city receives the Historic Preservation Fund grant program, which we have one right now, and we had one that did the downtown survey. It values the donation of time contributed at minimum wage. And unless you're a qualified professional with documented evidence that you actually make $87 an hour, and in which case that value would be credited as your value, the value of your time donated to the project. I was also given this value, and I apologize that I don't have the source other than someone at the State Historic Preservation Office gave this to me. It said a number of certified local governments around the country use this value for the assessment of volunteer time throughout the country for their own grant programs. And as you can see, Kansas in the table down below, an hour of volunteer time is valued at $18.45, which is significantly more than minimum wage and works in the applicant's favor for the donation and accumulation of donated time. And the committee decided to use this as the more administrative calculation of the value of donated time as in-kind contribution to the match. And so this basically is what we're anticipating to use. This is what was approved by the committee and what we're planning on using for valuation. That will be determined, the receipts, the value of time will be accumulated or accounted for in the same manner as a receipt for service. Just as you would pay for a service and be issued an invoice and receipt, the same mechanism would apply for time, where there would be a receipt issued to the grant recipient, or vice versa, some documentation that the grant recipient would receive from the applicant saying, this is how much time I volunteered and this is what it was worth. That information then would be provided to me as staff for verification and accumulation of the total value of time that has been donated. The next substantive change between this version and the previous version, that all applicants, as part of their application, are responsible for the submission of an estimated economic impact of the completed project towards the city's overall heritage tourism industry, along with a marketing plan for how the site or facility will be promoted as a tourist destination. Since this does use transient guest tax funds, its purpose is to enhance the tourism industry in Topeka, and it's incumbent on applicants to demonstrate how exactly their project will be used to further the advancement of tourism in Topeka, and that is now part of the application process.
Could you repeat that one more time?
All applicants are responsible for the submission of an estimated economic impact of the completed project toward the city's overall heritage tourism industry, along with the marketing plan for how the site or facility will be promoted as a tourist destination. I have copies of these suggestions here. The fourth change is that all applicants are responsible for the demonstration of public support for the project, in part by the demonstration of private sector financial contributions in support of the overall scope of the project. thought if the project, or the committee actually agreed, that if this is public money that people are seeking, the project itself should have some demonstrated level of public support in order to receive public funding. So the applicant is now responsible for demonstrating some level of demonstrable public support for their overall project. And the last substantive change is that all applicants are responsible for presenting a plan to the Historic Tourism Committee demonstrating their ability to use the site for public benefit for a time period of 10 years post-completion. That is part of the evaluation criteria and part of the application requirements, that they present essentially, not as detailed as a full-blown business plan, but some mechanism by which the tourism committee can use to assure themselves in making their recommendation to you that the site will be used and available and open to the public for 10 years after, at the minimum of 10 years after the project is completed and open to the public. So those are the major substantive changes, and they were approved by the Historic Tourism Committee. And the guidelines that you have, I'll just, for whatever it's worth, note that the dates in there are completely arbitrary. Obviously, a couple of those dates are already passed, and so it will go open to the public, you know, as soon as you all decide, and the dates will be relative to, you know, to your decision here today.
Application deadline.
4 p.m.
Okay.
September 6th.
Yeah.
Tim, could, two of the council members are new, and frankly, I can't say that I have a firm grasp on this. A certain percentage of the transient guest tax funds are allocated to a historic preservation fund.
Yes, as I understand it, and if I'm wrong in this, please correct me. There is a standard amount that goes to the Great Overland Station,
Right.
and that is a 0.5% or a 0.5 cent increase in the transient guest tax, or a 0.5 cent's worth of the transient guest tax goes to the Overland Station, up to $200,000. Any excess that is raised through that 0.5 cent increase goes into this fund, this historic preservation or historic assets preservation fund. And it's not it's not detailed by a percentage. It's simply the remainder that's left over after the obligation of the city's obligation to the Overland Station. And it fluctuates from year to year depending on what that excess is, but historically it has averaged roughly about $60,000 per year. So it's not, in the large scale of things, you know, a whole lot of money, but it's all there is to work with. And the value that you have in the guidelines here in the second paragraph, it quotes a figure of $97,750. That, at the time that this was written, was cumulative from 2012 and to that date in 2013. I suspect right now it is in the realm of, in the area of about 150,000 roughly, because we've accumulated transient guest taxes, you know, for 9 months through 2013. So the figure there in that second paragraph of $97,750 is, again, it's variable. It will probably go up from that for this 1 year. It won't be an annual allocation of that much money. It'll just be whatever's in there at this time. And historically, the fund also is not an annual allocation. If whatever money is not spent from the fund in 1 year carries over to the next. So it's not an annual line item that the council budgets for. It just carries over to the next year, anything that's not spent.
Well, one of the questions that I have, maybe this is just an issue of semantics. This ordinance that you handed out is called the Historic Preservation Fund. but the grant guidelines are denominated historic tourism. And I guess conceptually what I don't understand is, in my mind, there's a difference between historic preservation and historic tourism.
Yes.
Is that,
Yes.
can you,
Well, if I understand it's a good.
it's confusing.
Yeah, I understand that. The fund that, the source where the money for the grant program comes from is the Historic Assets Preservation Fund, or Historic Preservation Fund. The program itself is the Historic Tourism Grant Program. So the fund and the program are not necessarily the same thing. The program uses monies from the fund, but it's not dependent on the, I mean, it is sort of dependent on the fund, but it's a result of the fund being there. It utilizes the fund's money. Does that get to the?
Well, I understand it. It's
Okay.
just a little confusing,
Yeah.
because historic preservation may not have anything to do with historic tourism.
True. However, I mean, yes, absolutely true. However, given the fact that the source of money is transient guest tax money, the
I
focus
understand.
is on the heritage tourism, which heritage and historic
Right.
preservation are much more closely related than just general preservation and general tourism.
Now, we-
So, I mean, it's trying to allocate the funds as closely as possible to both preservation and tourism. So, and that's why there's
Okay.
the seeming overlap
Right,
of purposes and language used.
okay. Did you have any other comments you wanted to make, or should we open up to questions from the committee?
Yeah, questions, it's fine.
Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, on the question of the Historic Preservation Fund as opposed to the Heritage Tourism Grant Fund, you're saying that the Heritage Tourism Grant Fund is subject to the Historic Preservation Fund. Does the Historic Preservation Fund do anything else besides fund this program?
Yes, there is a split in the fund. 85% of the monies in the Historic Preservation Fund are used for the historic or heritage tourism grant program. The other 15% is identified in the ordinance. I'll just read from the ordinance. Disbursement of funds for project identified in subsections B2 and B3 shall not exceed 15% of the total amount of the historic preservation funds allocated for each calendar year. And sections B2 and B3 are marketing of the city's historical assets, and 3, and this is probably the larger of the two options here, providing financial commitments associated with the securing grant funding from government or private sources. So, for instance, if the city of Topeka wanted to receive a grant, wanted to apply for a grant from the state of Kansas or any other entity which required cash match, then this 15% could be used to secure that larger source of money from an outside source through a different grant. And all expenditures, whether they be through the historic tourism program or what I just described as the securing grant assistance as match, would be approved for recommendation by the Historic Tourism Committee and would be subject to your ultimate approval as the Transient Guest Tax Committee, because it's all coming from the Transient Guest Tax Fund.
So the entire Historic Preservation Fund comes from Transient Guest Tax?
Yes.
There's no other source?
Right, right.
Okay.
Well, historically, yes, it's all come from the Transient Guest Tax. I mean, money is tight, and no one knows that more than you do, but theoretically, I mean, yeah, there could be other allocations into the Historic Preservation Fund from other sources, such as CDBG or any other. I mean, it's not limited exclusively to the Transient Guest Tax, but at the present time, that's its only source of funding. And has been since it was initiated.
Tim, do you have any more questions this
No,
time? Mayor?
that's all I had.
Tim, could you speak to the process by which the grant, the 2013 grant application procedures were developed?
Process through which they were developed.
Correct.
Well, I'll do the best I can. The program, as I mentioned, was inactive in 2012.
Because, why?
I actually can't give, I don't know. It was, I don't know, you'd have to ask my previous boss, Mr. Thurbin.
Okay.
It was under direction just not to
Okay.
do the program that year, and the reason for that, I
Okay.
don't know. But following that year of inactivity, he did suggest and recommend changes to the overall grant program.
Did Mr. Thurston?
Mr. Thurman, yeah, to the overall program, and that was the impetus for what you have before you today, was
Okay.
that process. I went through and had several discussions with the city's finance department with problems that they had in accounting for matching funds from grant recipients, and it was honestly fairly difficult on my end as staff, acting as the middle person, receiving documentation from grant recipients and giving that application to finance, and not having enough of the information that finance required in order to allocate funds through the city's vendor system. This simplifies that, and so I started the entire process of revision with the city's finance department to make sure that since they are the ones that actually write the checks, and they fundamentally, and they'll be administering the program financially. Anyway, they'll be the ones running the program financially. So I wanted to make sure that the changes would work for them, and I listened to their recommendations and suggestions and included them very, very carefully in the guidelines that we have here. So from that perspective, I think that it is an improvement over what had been programmed in the past. After, and you'll have to forgive me on time, it's been quite some time, and I have a little bit of trouble narrowing down which month what occurred, but towards the beginning of this year, I'll just generalize it that way, at the beginning of this year, I produced a version of this and worked it over with finance. And also the ordinance then that created the changes that we discussed earlier, that created the historic tourism grant review committee. That ordinance was completed, which kind of got the ball rolling, and that committee was created, and we met on 3 occasions and they passed their own bylaws and went through a couple revisions of the grant program. And through the discussion with the grant review committee, there were some questions, and some very valid questions, and a couple of suggestions that were made, but they were easily accommodated. And when at the last meeting, it was almost unanimously voted for a recommendation for your consideration. There was one member who abstained from the vote, but other than that, it was pretty good, from my perspective, very visible support from the committee members that this was a good program.
And what committee was that?
The Historic Tourism Committee, which consists of the 9 members of the Topeka Landmarks Commission, 1 member from the Topeka Tourism Alliance, 1 representative of the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and the Lodging Association.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're all established
Right.
by ordinance.
Okay. And is this a new ordinance?
It is fairly, yeah, it is recently, I'm not sure if it's new or revised. I mean, Mary,
It's amended.
it's amended, yeah, okay.
All right.
And it is new in the creation of the membership of the Grant Review Committee.
Okay.
And their role is only to make recommendations to you as the Transient Guest Tax Committee. So
Okay.
they don't make any, final decisions.
Okay. So this is before this committee for us to recommend to the full council that this be adopted, or
I
do
think
we have
it's-
final say on
I
this?
think it's your final say. If I'm.
It's legal,
if I understand
concur?
that right, yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
So-
Okay,
Okay.
all right. Any other, do you have any questions?
Oh, yeah. I've got a few.
Go ahead.
Thank
Jump
you,
in.
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. I've applied for a lot of grants in my previous careers. So there's a couple of things in the grant application that I have a question on.
Sure.
Where is it that states the maximum they can apply for?
There is not a maximum. It is dependent on how much money is available in the fund on any given year.
Okay, so it's like
In-
first come, the
Well-
ones that get their application in first?
Not necessarily, no.
No.
It'll be a competitive process.
Okay.
And the Grant Review Committee will have to weigh the volume of applications against the funding available.
Okay,
And within that, the consideration of need by each individual applicant and their project.
okay.
So,
But you don't state in that, a lot of times grantees want to know how much they can apply
right,
for.
I understand
So-
that. And that, unfortunately, well, that, I suppose, that could be a recommendation.
Yeah.
You can make
to
that recommendation.
Maximum or
Yeah,
whatever.
you can make that recommendation,
it's
but it
usually-
was, it's a valid recommendation, to have that inserted as a maximum grant receipt. However, the total volume of money available and the potential, or the pool of potential applicants really isn't all that large.
Right. It's
So-
dependent upon the fund.
Right, there are too many variables on
Right.
the other end to actually pinpoint an exact minimum. It will be just dependent on how much is available and how many people apply.
But it's never more than, the applicant cannot apply for more than what's in the fund.
True,
So that
Right.
would be the maximum amount that would be
Right.
allowed,
Right.
is what is in the fund.
right.
Okay, and so this is only funded through, may I? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is only funded through the transient guest tax? There's
Yes.
no other funds that come in from the state or the feds
Nope.
that would be added to this fund?
It's unique to Topeka.
But what about, because your previous, which is a question, who in the city does the B2 and 3 of the,
Yeah.
so who does that? That they would go after
That's a
financial
good-
commitments from the
That's
feds
a-
or the state?
No, that's a good question, and pending your decision at a subsequent meeting, we have another set of administrative guidelines for those two provisions specifically.
Okay,
And, they were written with the intent, the city of Topeka has no line allocation for historic preservation at all.
okay,
And it was hoped that this could be utilized by the city to leverage other grants for larger sums of money to,
so then the fund could be larger if there was more money that the city secured for giving out grants?
sure, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So my question was then who in the city does B2 and 3? What staff does that?
It would, the guidelines that are requisite to define that, which haven't been approved yet, it would be the city of Topeka.
But
And
what department?
Theoretically, the planning
Planning
department.
department.
The planning department does historic preservation,
Okay.
and
Okay.
it would be the planning department that would utilize that funding. And in some cases, it might be the full 15%, other cases it might not be, but most of the money was allocated to the grant program, and just the little bit of other money was reserved for matching, a source of matching funds for larger grants.
Mr. Fyander, do you have a comment?
Sure. Bill Fyander, Planning Director. I would just add that it would be we would intake and make recommendations to the Tourism Committee, Grant Review Tourism Committee, which then would flow to you to make the final decision on that 15. It would start with us, if that helps.
And somebody on the tourism committee could actually go after grants from the feds or the state for tourism for Topeka? I mean, which is basically what you're trying to do here in 3, providing financial commitments, the securing grant
Yes.
funding from government. Okay,
Yes.
okay. And then a follow-up question would be, or one of my final questions
ahead.
is, you said that they had to demonstrate public support, and I couldn't find where that is in the grant application, that they have to, was it letters of support, or what kind of demonstration do they have to?
That's also a good note.
Because you got the economic impact analysis, but then I couldn't find the public support.
Right.
And I don't know how to see it.
It's on page 3.
Last page.
Organizational structure,
6 bullet.
page 6. Organizational structure, please summarize the organizational structure of the organization seeking grant assistance. Should include the date of incorporation, organization, mission, statement, membership, and board of directors, financial balance sheets for the previous 3 years, including all revenues by source and organizational expenditures.
But that's not really support for the grant application.
True. That can be added as a specific.
It's on page 310. It's the green bullet.
Well, the
But the
evaluation
application,
criteria.
Yeah, but the application.
It is
people-
listed. What she's citing is listed as a part of the evaluation criteria, but it is not
In the
accommodated
application process.
in the application form itself, which.
And that's what grantees will
Yeah,
use, is the
yeah,
application.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So that can
Just add
easily
that.
be added as part of the application form itself.
Right, letters of support,
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Okay, and then my final question just says, hey, we couldn't use these funds to update the city council chambers? It's not on the historic register, is it?
No.
Do that.
Thank you.
Well, I guess that would depend on if the council chambers are a tourist destination.
Yeah, I don't think it is.
We can make it that way.
Thank you.
All right,
Mr.
any
Chair.
other questions? All right, Mr. Schmidt, any questions?
The only other question I had was, you said that you worked with finance to go through this, and I was
Mhm.
just wondering, what's the verification mechanism? Who's in charge of, verifying, the,
Oh, well,
is that gonna be finance or?
no, well, finance will write checks, but the process will be that the grant recipient, once they have completed, received their award will be based on approved work items.
Mhm.
So they complete work item A, and I go visit,
So you're the verification
document
mechanism.
that it's been completed, receive the receipts, forward those receipts to finance, they write a check for half the value.
Okay,
So that would be the process.
all right, thank you, that's all I have.
Karen, did you have any questions about the guidelines?
I did have a few. I had submitted some comments earlier and was advised by staff that they just wanted them held until today. Overall, when this came out in early August, I read the draft and read through the minutes of the tourism committee, and I was just very impressed by the process and the work that had been done, and I just wanted to say so. I think that the process and the recording of it that the group went through, the staff and the group went through for this, are the way these things should happen, and I just wanted to pass that along. I had sent in the note, there were a couple of typos I caught, which I will not go into. But similar to Councilwoman Schwartz's comments, as someone who has written and written grant applications and had to administer them too, looking at this as a template, I did think that on page 2 in number, let's see, page 2, number 7, and then in the grant operations procedures, there are, somehow that number 7 doesn't seem right. I think it would be helpful if the staff, if those items designate exactly who on the staff the applicant should talk to, so that they understand who to check with to get their application in order. It's been a while since I wrote this, but obviously in number 7, there's discussion that the applicant would need to contract with licensed architects, engineers for final plans, and so on. Perhaps a reference to who they should check with to make sure they're getting the right contractors in order. And then in paragraph 2, for all work completed, the applicant shall submit paid receipts to the city for reimbursement. We've talked about that before. If it designates the staff who by position name or by who the staff is, then that applicant will know who they need to check with.
Sure.
You're wanting to run
Okay.
this pretty tight, and I think that will help.
Rather than to the city in general.
To the city, exactly. Is
Okay,
it to you
to
in
the
planning? Is
planning,
it to
yeah.
Pam or her designee in
Planning
finance?
department,
That's
yeah.
a big difference.
Planning staff.
Exactly.
Okay, right. Yeah.
And who is it then in number 7 that will tell them whether, in advance, whether that licensed architect and engineer that they have solicited is acceptable, so that they can move forward?
I don't disagree with the premise, the concern. However, I don't know, I mean, this would be, I guess, a legal question, but I don't know that we're allowed to make recommendations for specific architects and engineers.
Not at all. But what you have experienced in the past is that some of the applicants have been seasoned nonprofits or historical redevelopers that have had staff or have had relationships with
Right.
professionals,
Yeah.
and others have been very grassroots and just getting started. That's a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
It's a matter of who they consult with through that, so they know whether they're giving you what you want.
True, and I appreciate that, but my reaction is you can see it on my face. I don't have a list right now
No,
of
I
who
didn't.
who people are.
Not
But-
at all suggesting that you tell them who they work with, but if they have questions about that grant development, just
Okay.
a reference
All right,
to
yeah, that's
with whom to consult to make sure they're giving you what you want.
right. Oh, yeah, that can be done. Yeah.
Not who you want, just
Right. Okay.
what you want.
All right. Gotcha.
You also mentioned already that these dates were just plugged in for the sample.
Yeah. Right.
I did see, though, in your committee deliberations, that there was a sense on the part of the committee that late August, September and October were the ideal times of year to do this grant process.
Mhm.
And so, if you're wanting to set that, I would suggest going back in and working the dates. Second Monday in August for the preliminary, based on what I was reading, the second Monday in August, or
Rather than specific dates.
rather than a specific date, but go
Right.
ahead and use some brackets so that when you actually put out the RFP, you've got dates in there, but your reference default document does lock you into that time of year if that's what you'd wanted. Because, like the first Friday in September is your due date on here, and that would get your
Okay.
allocations out by the last Friday in September.
Right, yeah.
And
Okay. Yeah,
would give-
that can be done.
Because also you're gonna have people that are wanting to understand what the rhythm of this is.
Right.
If they're not ready,
Right.
when's it gonna roll around
Right.
again?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the dates were completely, I mean, not arbitrary, but I mean, subject to change. So
Well,
it's,
and I just-
yeah, and that's a good suggestion to have them based on, as you suggested, the first Monday or second Monday of any given month rather than on a specific date.
and perhaps have that in there before the document is adopted. But that's the pleasure of this committee today.
Yeah, well,
Um,
true, yeah.
The third item that I'd had on that early submission to you all was that, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes grant funds have been carried over.
Yep.
And I wondered if there shouldn't be prominently in here a disclaimer that, that's saying the Historic Preservation's Grant Committee reserves the right to recommend awarding of only part of the available funds in any grant year. Something like that made it clear to the applicant that you might not give out all the money, that you're gonna decide based on the merits of the applications that you have. And that you might carry some money over.
I think that is in the application process number 5.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
That
Oh.
doesn't say, so if, let's say I know that you don't have any other applicants, and so I apply for the whole $90,000 and I feel like you
Right.
ought to give it to me because
Right.
you got it.
Yeah.
For it to be clear that you're gonna make that award based on what my project needs this year, whoever.
Okay, so, I mean, how, in what language would you suggest, that be accommodated through?
Well, I can send you this email again.
Okay.
What I had played with was just the Historic Preservation's Grant Committee reserves the right to recommend awarding of only part of the available project funds in any grant year.
Okay,
Somebody might phrase that better or
well, no,
differently,
that
but,
sounds to the point, good,
that
yeah.
just, to me, that's a clear message
Right,
that there might be carryover.
Right.
funds.
right, and it also, somewhere along the same lines, would be, I think, wise to add along the same lines that the recommendations of the Historic Tourism Grant Review Committee are forwarded to you for your final authority. So what they decide, is only a recommendation,
Right.
and you can either increase or decrease or deny entirely. It's up to you based on the recommendations that you receive.
Well, I think the suggestion goes along with your number 5. What that does is allow you to reject all of them.
True.
If you chose in a
Right.
given year, if you felt that they weren't ready for funding.
Right, yeah, number 5 does actually say that, yeah.
One last item, if I might.
Okay, can
Go
you?
ahead, yeah. You mentioned the volunteer rate, and I did see that in the minutes. I'm not sure is there a reference in this little document to what that rate would be so that an applicant would know?
No, it's not referenced in the application form. It could be,
If you're using a standard rate,
Right.
it would seem that you should,
Yeah.
because there's a difference between $7 an hour and
yeah.
20.
Yeah, there is, and, yeah, some reference, if this rate, I mean, this rate is updated annually, so it's subject to change, but whatever that annual allocation is or determination is, it should be reflected in the annual application process, so, yeah, we can,
If you do know what the source of that is, and to say that the volunteer rate would be
Right.
based on the most
Right.
recent version of the,
right.
whatever that is.
The only title that I have on this is the Independent Sector's Value of Volunteer Time, and I apologize that I don't know.
Well, the independent sector is an entity,
Okay,
so
all right, well,
maybe that's where,
that's apparently where it came from.
okay.
Yeah, the independent sector, I mean, you can think of it generically as just the private sector.
Right, but that is an entity.
Okay, all right. I didn't know that. Now I do. But yeah, they update this and they say that for the state-by-state level, 2011 is the latest year for which data was available. Nationally, they had 2012, but for state 2011.
Yeah.
was the latest year.
Saw that, and I think it's great. I just think that
It-
reference
it
so
can
that
be
the
updated,
applicants
yeah.
know would be great. Thank you, that's it.
Councilwoman Schwartz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this like I read somewhere that it's 2 years, they have 2 years to complete? Okay.
That is not changed from
Okay.
the current
So
version of the program.
when are the funds awarded? And since it's based on, I mean, it's reimbursement from money spent, so when do they get the grant award? After they spend the money or before they spend?
It is concurrent with the overall scheme of the project and would depend, I mean, once they receive the grant award, sign a grant agreement.
Right.
And they're free to go execute the projects and the elements that they have identified.
But they have to spend the money first and then
Yes.
get reimbursed?
Yes,
Okay,
right.
okay.
And that would be, but you don't have to have full completion of everything
Right.
before you submit a receipt. I mean,
Right.
if you restore a wall, you could submit the receipt for completion of that
Right.
wall.
Right.
And then the next one, the roof, or
And
the
the-
next one, the windows.
Right.
and,
The quarterly reports would report that if they didn't spend any money that quarter,
Yeah,
they would say no money spent.
right.
What happens then if there is, okay, so they don't get the money ahead of time, so there's not any chances that it's money that has not been spent before the 2 years is up, that's, they haven't gotten it?
Right.
Okay. My last question then is, since this is really only for those that are on the grant application, locally designated historic landmark on the, listed as, so it's meeting one of those three or all of those three?
One of those three.
One of those three.
Right.
Do we have any idea how many landmark designations that we have in the city?
Well, yes.
To know how many people would be applying?
Yes, we do. There are a known quantity of properties that are on each one of those three lists.
Okay.
I think the more direct question is how many of those eligible properties or listed properties would promote heritage tourism.
Right, okay.
And that was actually brought up for discussion during the last committee meeting, that realistically, there's probably only 6 or 7, maybe 8 entities, locations in
Would be
all
for
of
tourists.
Topeka that would fulfill all the criteria, be listed on one of the three levels, and have legitimate claim to be a tourist destination.
Okay. 8.
So I mean, roughly, I
Round
mean, it's I mean, that is unknown, but it's in that ballpark.
Okay.
It's not very many.
Okay. That answered my question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What's the, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had a lot of questions on this list. I had asked about the 2 years as well. I didn't see it in your committee minutes that it was really discussed at all, but I recall that there have been, one of the things about doing a big historic preservation project is that there are a variety
Yep.
of grant sources that are available, and of course, everybody wants to leverage every penny that they can.
Right.
And so if, for instance, somebody has their 50% together, and half of it's cash and half of it's in kind, then they're able to win this grant, but they've got an application deadline that's next summer. That's the next one that they'd have to be able to double that money with a
Yeah.
big historic preservation grant or something like that, where they don't really want to move forward until they've had a chance to go after that other matching money as well.
Right.
When you get into that cycle, which overall is very healthy for a project and is really good for getting a big project done, your time starts to go. And I think you've had some projects in the past that have pushed up or even exceeded that 2-year deadline. Was there any discussion of going to 3 years or having some language about extensions?
The project deadline is not for, well, semantics, I suppose, for, what you define as the 2-year. The projects that are defined in the grant application are what are assigned that 2-year deadline for completion. The overall scope of the project, many projects require more than 2 years to bring to fruition, and this is only just, I mean, realistically, it's a very tiny portion of the millions that a lot of projects need. So it's recognized that, you know, a lot of projects are gonna need more than 2 years. So the 2-year time frame is only for the installation of a ventilation system, or a dehumidification system, or the installation of windows, or tuck pointing, or whatever the specific initial immediate need of that property is. It's understood very well that the overall completion date for the entire project is dependent on much more money than can be secured through this grant program. So the 2-year deadline is not relative to completion of the entire project. Open the door and let public in.
If I could follow up. Well, sometimes doing it a piece at a time is not as cost effective as being able to do everything at once. I'm personally more familiar with transportation enhancement grants than with historic preservation grants, but with transportation enhancement grants, for instance, the state and the federal government say that anything that you do separate from that grant can't count as your match money toward this master grant that they're offering. And so they insist that you wait and do everything all at once, so that it all, in order for your original piece to count as match money for this next activity. And sometimes, you know, rather than just doing an HVAC system over here and just doing the proscenium of the stage over here,
Right.
if you can leverage that money into going in and doing the entire heating and cooling system, including all the ductwork all at once, or doing the entire redo of a stage or a wing of a building, it's much more cost effective than to just do it in pieces.
Yeah.
That's
Well, yeah, and I'm, no disagreement at all, and I'm struggling to find I don't know if there is a correct and right way to coordinate the timing of all of the funding sources out there that an applicant could use. I mean, if you timed it right, if the stars aligned just correctly, you know, and
Sure.
you had, you know, the ability to use this grant and this grant, you know, all collectively towards the same goal, that's ideal, but I don't know how to guarantee that through this program, so that by all means, this grant could be used as match for another grant. By all means, if they have matching requirements to get a Heritage Trust Fund grant from the state, for instance. Okay.
I just
There's-
wondered whether, you know, obviously you want people to get going and get the project done. So
Yeah.
didn't want to discourage that, yet if there are opportunities like that, I would hate to see people cut off from being able to leverage this money into the next phase of their grant. And I just wasn't sure whether the guidelines allowed that flexibility, and if they didn't, whether they should. And I didn't try any language on that. Because we'd want to encourage people to try and go after that next step if they're not done, and it does take years. It just seemed like that had come up a couple times, and
Yeah, I appreciate that concern. It's a real strong, valid concern. I don't know how to craft the language to make it happen. I mean, I'd gladly entertain some suggestion for, you know, doing that, but I'm thinking out loud here, and I can't come up with
well, that's why I wrote you in advance, because I
Well,
thought
yeah.
if I understood more what the
Yeah.
sentiments of the staff or the committee had been, and what that experience was, I could come prepared with something, but I didn't know.
It's something that we can certainly consider, although timing-wise, I mean, I know that the Historic Tourism Committee was very anxious to get this out to the public,
Absolutely.
and I mean, it might be advisable to consider that as a revision for next year's application and get this one out this year as soon as we can. And take that into advisement for, as a modification next year.
Well, that begs the question, if I could interrupt. Does the committee, Councilwoman Hiller has offered 4 amendments to this, to the guidelines. Does the committee want to entertain a motion to direct staff to include those in another draft to be brought back before the committee? Or do we want to just consider this as is? Mr. Schmidt?
I possibly might add a fifth to that. But I can do that now, or,
If you can do it now, if you'd like.
okay. Along the lines of what she was saying, I don't think it would be particularly difficult to, on the 2-year window, to say, to put some sort of, and again, you know, we would have to come up with the language for this, but to put some sort of language in there that says that if the applicant can demonstrate a need for an extension, that extension would be subject to, you know,
Right.
review by the committee again, and, you know, make it within 6 months of the 2-year deadline expiring.
Sure, yeah, and that is in the program now, and I thought it was in here, but if it's not, then it easily can be put back in. I mean, any request for extension can be presented to the Historic Tourism Committee for, consideration.
Well, I like
Something to that effect.
I like the idea of a 2-year window, just because it, we want people to get started on these and get them done, but there are circumstances where that might not be doable, and I think putting the 2-year window into place and then allowing for
Right.
exceptional circumstances to prolong that would be fairly simple.
Okay, we are running out of time. We have, we're gonna have to adjourn at 5 o'clock, and it's about 2 till. So what does the committee want to do? Ms. Schwartz?
I'll make a motion that we, based on the recommendations that we have made to staff, that a new draft be presented as soon as possible, and we would review it and then come back together for a quick meeting to approve it and get it out there.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second that.
All right. It's been moved and seconded that staff make the amendments that Councilwoman Hiller and others have suggested and bring the draft back for the committee's recommendation. We have not had an opportunity to solicit comments from the public, and I certainly want to do that in a subsequent meeting. So, I guess we need to vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right. Tim, do you have what you need?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
All right. Try to get this back to us so we can reconvene the committee.
Yeah. Yeah.
And keep this process.
Should be able to get the modifications made tomorrow and forwarded to you by Monday.
No, that's fine, we don't need, okay,
Well, I mean, as soon as possible. Yeah.
sure. And then we'll reconvene another transient guest tax committee to go over the proposed changes and to solicit public comment. Okay?
Okay.
All right, anything else before the committee? All right, motion to adjourn?
Second.
All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.